Sister Maria pressed her hand to her swelling belly as the convent doors slammed shut behind her. But she had no idea that the man watching from the black sedan across the street would soon call her the holiest woman he'd ever known. Sister Maria's fingers trembled as they traced the worn wooden beads of her rosary, the familiar rhythm of prayer offering little comfort this gray October morning. The chapel of St. Catherine's Convent felt different now. The stained glass windows that once painted her world in holy light now seemed to cast shadows of judgment across the stone floor. She pressed her palm against her stomach, where beneath the rough fabric of her habit, life grew in defiance of every vow she'd taken. The heavy oak doors creaked open, and Sister Catherine's footsteps echoed through the sacred silence. "Mother Superior wants to see you," she whispered, her eyes unable to meet Maria's. "In her office. Now." Maria's heart hammered as she walked the familiar corridors, past the portraits of saints whose marble eyes seemed to follow her with disappointment. The scent of burning candles mixed with the musty smell of centuries, old stone, a combination that had once meant home but now felt suffocating. She knocked on Mother Superior's door with a hand that betrayed nothing of the storm raging inside her. "Come." Mother Superior Catherine Margaret sat rigid behind her mahogany desk, her weathered face set in stone. The silver crucifix on the wall behind her caught the morning light, casting a shadow that fell directly across Maria's chair, a symbolism so obvious it felt orchestrated by a cruel god. "Sit down, Sister Maria." The words hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Maria lowered herself into the chair, her movements careful, protective. She had practiced this moment in her mind 1,000 times, but nothing had prepared her for the weight of actual judgment. "How long?" Mother Superior's voice was ice. 3 months. The confession fell from Maria's lips like a stone into still water, sending ripples of consequence through the silence. 3 months of living a lie. 3 months of taking communion with sin in your belly. 3 months of making a mockery of your vows. Each sentence was a lash. Who is the Father? Maria's eyes found the floor. It doesn't matter now. Doesn't matter? Mother Superior's voice rose, shattering the perpetual quiet of the convent. You have disgraced this house of God, violated your sacred vows, and brought shame upon every sister who has walked these halls. Of course it matters. He's gone. Maria's voice was barely audible. He said he loved me. That God would understand. But when I told him about the baby. Spare me your romantic delusions, child. Love. Mother Superior stood, her black robes making her look like a specter of judgment. You knew nothing of love. You knew lust, temptation, the weakness of flesh. And now you've chosen your path. The words hit Maria like physical blows. She had given 8 years of her life to this place, had found God in these walls, had believed herself called to serve. But perhaps Mother Superior was right. Perhaps she had never truly understood what love meant. You have until this afternoon to gather your belongings. I won't have the other sisters further corrupted by your presence. 15 miles across the city, David Sterling sat at the head of a conference table that cost more than most people's homes, watching his board of directors discuss charitable donations with the passion of accountants reviewing tax deductions. The morning sun streamed through floor to ceiling windows of his penthouse office, illuminating figures that represented lives changed, supposedly. But the numbers felt hollow, meaningless. Just another way to move money around and feel better about the emptiness eating at his core. The Sterling Foundation approved $2.3 million for local religious institutions this quarter, his CFO droned on, including a significant contribution to St. Catherine's Convent for their community outreach programs. David nodded absently, his attention drifting to the cityscape beyond the glass. 42 years old, worth more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes, and yet he felt spiritually bankrupt. His ex-wife Jennifer had said it best during their divorce. You can buy anything except the one thing you actually need, David. A soul. She wasn't wrong. He'd built an empire in real estate and investments, had his name on hospital wings and scholarship funds, but it all felt like elaborate window dressing on a life devoid of real meaning. Even his philanthropy felt calculated, strategic. Good for tax breaks and better for his public image. Sir. His assistant's voice broke through his reverie. The car is ready for your site visit to the women's shelter. David straightened, adjusting his Italian silk tie. Another photo opportunity. Another chance to be seen doing good. But maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time he'd actually feel something real. The black sedan moved through autumn streets painted gold and crimson, past coffee shops filled with people who seemed to have found whatever he was missing. His driver navigated toward the older part of the city, where buildings held history and stories, where life felt less sanitized than his marble and glass world. They were stopped at a traffic light near St. Catherine's Convent when David saw her. A young woman in a nun's habit stood on the convent steps, a small suitcase in her hand and her head held high despite the obvious distress in her posture. Even from a distance, there was something about her, a dignity in the face of what was clearly rejection, a grace that seemed to glow around her like the saints in the stained glass windows of his childhood church. As he watched, she placed a protective hand over her stomach, and understanding dawned. The convent doors had closed behind her with the finality of judgment, but she stood there like she was blessing the very people who had cast her out. In that moment, David Sterling, a man who owned half the city but had never owned a moment of real peace, felt something stir in the hollow place where his soul should have been. What do you think drives people to show grace even when facing rejection? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear about a time when you witnessed unexpected dignity in difficult circumstances. The black sedan idled at the curb as David watched the young nun descend the convent steps with deliberate grace. Each step seemed measured, purposeful. Not the hurried flight of shame he might have expected, but the careful movement of someone carrying something precious. The October wind caught her veil, and for a moment she paused to steady herself against the wrought iron railing. Sir. His driver's voice seemed to come from another world. The shelter appointment. Wait. David's hand was already on the door handle before he'd consciously decided to move. Something about this moment felt orchestrated by forces beyond coincidence. The timing, the location, the way the afternoon light seemed to gather around her like a benediction. He stepped onto the sidewalk, his handmade shoes clicking against concrete still damp from morning rain. She hadn't seen him yet. Her attention was focused on the small piece of paper in her hand, an address, perhaps, or final instructions from a life that had just ended. Excuse me. His voice carried across the space between them, gentle but clear. Are you all right? She turned, and David felt the world shift on its axis. Her face was young, maybe 26, 27, with dark eyes that held depths of sorrow and strength he hadn't expected. There were no tears, no theatrical display of grief. Instead, there was something he could only describe as luminous dignity, as if she were lit from within by a peace that transcended circumstances. I'm fine, thank you. Her voice was soft but steady, with just the trace of an accent he couldn't place. Irish, perhaps, or maybe simply the careful diction of someone who had spent years in prayer and contemplation. You don't look fine. He took a step closer, noting how she instinctively shifted to keep distance between them. I'm sorry, I don't mean to intrude. I saw you come out of the convent, and you looked like someone who might need help. A shadow crossed her face. Help from a stranger? That's kind, but I've learned to be careful about the kindness of men I don't know. The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, and David felt a stab of understanding mixed with something else, protectiveness, maybe, or recognition of a wound that matched his own in some fundamental way. My name is David Sterling. He kept his distance, his hands visible and non-threatening. "I was on my way to visit a women's shelter downtown. If you need a place to stay, or just, if you need anything at all." David Sterling. She repeated his name like she was testing its weight. The David Sterling? The one whose name is on half the charity buildings in the city. He winced. Even his philanthropy had become a kind of prison, a label that preceded him everywhere. Among other things, yes. "But right now I'm just someone who can see that you're in trouble, and I'd like to help if you'll let me." She studied his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed, as if she were reading something written there that he himself had never noticed. When she spoke again, her voice carried a gentleness that somehow made the air around them feel sacred. "Why would you want to help someone like me?" "Someone like you?" The question caught him off guard. What does that mean? Her hand moved to her stomach in a gesture so subtle he might have missed it if he hadn't been watching so carefully. Someone who has fallen. Someone who has broken sacred vows. Someone who... Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. Someone who is carrying a child conceived in sin. The words hung between them like a challenge and a confession rolled into one. David felt something crack open inside his chest. Not judgment, but its opposite. Here was someone who spoke of sin with the authority of experience, yet carried herself with more grace than any saint in his childhood catechism books. "I see someone who is brave enough to protect life even when it costs her everything." The words surprised him with their certainty. "I see someone who walked out of those doors with her head held high instead of crawling away in shame. That doesn't look like sin to me. It looks like..." He paused, searching for the right word. Holiness. She stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. Holiness. "Sir, I'm pregnant. Unmarried. Cast out from the only home I've known for 8 years. I'm the opposite of holy. Are you?" He stepped closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in her dark eyes, close enough to catch the faint scent of chapel incense that still clung to her habit. "Because from where I stand, you look like someone who chose love over fear, life over convenience. You look like someone who understands what it means to sacrifice for something greater than yourself." "You don't understand." Her composure cracked for the first time, revealing the pain beneath her controlled exterior. "I broke my vows. I gave myself to a man who promised me love and abandoned me the moment I told him about the baby. I've disappointed God, disappointed the sisters who raised me, disappointed everyone who believed in me." "Or maybe," David said quietly, "you're exactly where you're supposed to be." The words surprised them both. She looked at him like he might be dangerous in ways she hadn't considered, and he felt exposed by his own certainty. But something about this moment, this woman, this convergence of broken lives on a random Tuesday afternoon, felt like the first real thing that had happened to him in years. "I don't even know your name," he said. "Maria." She said it simply, without titles or explanations. "Just Maria now." "Well, just Maria." He smiled at his own joke, relieved when he saw her lips twitch in response. "Would you let me buy you lunch? Somewhere we can sit down and talk about what comes next." She looked back at the convent doors, then at the suitcase in her hand, then at his face. Whatever she saw there seemed to tip some internal balance. "I suppose," she said slowly, "I have to eat somewhere. Sometimes the most sacred encounters happen in our most broken moments. Have you ever found unexpected grace when you needed it most? Share your story in the comments. I believe we all have moments when strangers become angels." The small cafe David chose was deliberately unremarkable, a corner bistro with checkered tablecloths and the kind of anonymity that wealth couldn't buy but influence could arrange. Maria sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since grown cold, her dark eyes studying him with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easy kindness. "You're analyzing me," David observed, cutting into his untouched sandwich. "I can practically hear the gears turning. I'm trying to understand what you want from me." Her directness caught him off guard. "In my experience, men who offer help to vulnerable women usually expect something in return." The words hit like a slap, and David felt heat rise in his chest, not anger at her, but at whatever had taught her to expect the worst from masculine kindness. "What I want is to help someone who clearly needs it. Nothing more. Nothing more." She repeated his words with skeptical emphasis. A millionaire philanthropist sees a pregnant nun on the street and decides to rescue her out of pure altruism. Forgive me if that sounds too good to be true. Maybe because you've been taught that you don't deserve good things. The observation slipped out before he could stop it, and her sharp intake of breath told him he'd hit too close to home. "Don't." Her voice carried warning. "Don't psychoanalyze me based on one conversation. You don't know anything about what I deserve or don't deserve." David set down his fork, recognizing the defensive walls slamming into place. He'd seen the same pattern in his ex-wife during their divorce, the retreat into self, protection the moment vulnerability threatened to surface. "You're right. I don't know you. But I know what I saw outside that convent." He leaned forward slightly, careful not to invade her space. "I saw someone who protected her dignity even when the people who were supposed to love her chose judgment instead. That tells me plenty. It tells you I'm stubborn. Pride was always my weakness." She fidgeted with her napkin, tearing small pieces from the corner. "The other sisters used to say I questioned too much, challenged authority too often. Maybe if I'd been more obedient, more willing to simply accept." "You'd what? Not be pregnant. Not be human." David's voice carried an edge of frustration that surprised them both. "Maria, whatever happened to you, whoever hurt you, that's not your fault. Isn't it?" The question exploded from her with sudden intensity. "I chose to break my vows. I chose to trust him. I chose to believe that love could justify anything." Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach. "I chose all of it." David watched her struggle with self-condemnation, recognizing something familiar in her pain. How many nights had he lain awake cataloging his own failures, his own choices that had led to emptiness? But seeing it reflected in her face made him understand how wrong that kind of thinking was. "Choice assumes you had complete information," he said carefully. "Did you know he would abandon you? Did you know the convent would cast you out? Did you choose any of that?" "I chose to trust." Her voice was barely audible. "I chose to believe that someone could love me, not Sister Maria, not the Bride of Christ, just me. And that choice led to this." The cafe around them buzzed with ordinary conversation, couples planning weekends, business people discussing deals, the normal rhythm of lives that hadn't been shattered by impossible circumstances. David found himself resenting their easy normalcy, their simple problems with simple solutions. "So what's your plan now?" He kept his voice neutral, fighting the urge to offer solutions she wasn't ready to hear. "Where will you go?" "I have a little money saved. Enough for a room somewhere, maybe a few weeks to figure things out." She straightened her shoulders, trying to project confidence that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm not completely helpless. I didn't say you were." But even as he spoke, David could see the fear beneath her forced optimism. A pregnant woman alone in the city with a few weeks' worth of savings. The mathematics were brutal. What about family? Dead. The word was flat, final. "My parents died when I was 17. That's how I ended up at the convent in the first place. The sisters took me in, gave me purpose, a calling. Or what I thought was a calling. Maybe it was a calling. Maybe it just led somewhere you didn't expect." Maria's laugh held no humor. You have an interesting way of looking at divine providence, Mr. Sterling. Most people would say I fell from grace, not that I was led here by God. Most people haven't looked into your eyes. The words came out more intense than he'd intended, and he saw her defensive walls rise another few inches. I'm sorry. I don't mean to make you uncomfortable. There's something about you that feels important. Significant. Significant. She tested the word like it might bite her. Is that what you collect, Mr. Sterling? Significant people to add to your charitable portfolio. The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to wound. How many of his relationships had been transactional at their core? How many people had he helped more for his own sense of purpose than for genuine compassion? Maybe, he admitted. But not this time. This time feels different. Different how? He struggled to find words for something he barely understood himself. Like maybe I'm not trying to save you. Maybe you're trying to save me. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Maria stared at him with an expression he couldn't read, surprise, maybe, or recognition of something she'd rather not acknowledge. I can't save anyone, she said finally. I can barely save myself. Neither can I. David signaled the waitress for the check, suddenly aware of how exposed this conversation had become. But maybe that's the point. Maria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the worn linoleum floor. I should go. Thank you for lunch, Mr. Sterling. And for your kindness. But I think it's better if we don't see each other again. Why? He rose with her, noting how she clutched her small purse like a shield. Because I'm trying to help? Because someone finally told you that you matter? Because I don't trust why you're doing this. Her voice carried a pain that went deeper than their short acquaintance could explain. And because I can't afford to trust the wrong person again. She moved toward the door with quick, determined steps, but David caught up to her on the sidewalk. The afternoon had grown cooler, and he could see her shiver beneath the thin fabric of her habit. Maria, wait. He pulled a business card from his wallet, pressing it into her reluctant hand. You don't have to call me. You don't have to trust me. But if you need anything at all, my number is on there. Day or night. She looked down at the card, then back at his face. Why does this matter to you so much? Because, David said, the truth surprising him with its simplicity. For the first time in years, something feels real. And I'm not ready to let that go. Without another word, Maria turned and walked away, disappearing into the flow of pedestrians with David's business card clutched in her fist and his heart following her down the street. 3 days passed like a slow bleed. David found himself driving past St. Catherine's Convent twice, then the cafe where they'd shared lunch, searching faces in crowds with the desperate hope of someone who had lost something precious. His assistant noticed his distraction during board meetings. His housekeeper commented on the untouched meals returned to the kitchen. He told himself it was concern for her welfare, but the hollow ache in his chest suggested something more complicated. On Thursday evening, his phone rang at 11:47 p.m. Mr. Sterling? The voice was barely recognizable. Maria's composed strength replaced by something fragile and desperate. I'm sorry to call so late, but I don't know who else. Where are you? David was already reaching for his keys, his heart hammering against his ribs. Are you hurt? St. Mary's Hospital. Emergency room. Her voice cracked. There was bleeding and I thought. I was so scared I was losing the baby. But they say everything's fine. It's just stress, they think, but they want to keep me overnight for observation and The words tumbled out in a rush that told him she was holding herself together by threads. I don't have insurance. Real insurance, I mean. The convent had some kind of coverage, but after I left, and the room costs and the tests I can't afford." She was crying now, trying to muffle the sound. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have called. I just didn't know what else to do. I'm on my way." David was already in the elevator, pressing the button for the parking garage. "Don't apologize, don't worry about the money, just breathe." "Which room?" "Fourth floor. Room 412. "But Mr. Sterling, I can't accept. We'll figure it out later. Just rest." The drive to St. Mary's passed in a blur of red lights and racing thoughts. David had navigated hostile corporate takeovers with less anxiety than he felt walking through those sterile hospital corridors. The smell of disinfectant and desperation reminded him of visiting his father during those final months. The helpless feeling of watching someone you cared about face forces beyond your control. He found her in a private room that someone's charity had clearly paid for, connected to monitors that beeped with mechanical reassurance. Her habit had been replaced by a hospital gown that made her look impossibly young and vulnerable. When she saw him in the doorway, her composure finally cracked completely. "You came," she whispered, and the relief in her voice broke something inside his chest. "Of course I came." He settled into the uncomfortable chair beside her bed, noting the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly. "How are you feeling?" "Foolish. Scared. Grateful." She managed a weak smile. "The doctor says the baby is fine. Strong heartbeat, normal development. The bleeding was just my body responding to stress." "What kind of stress?" But even as he asked, David could guess. 3 days alone in the city with limited money, trying to find work while visibly pregnant, sleeping God knew where. "I found a room in a boarding house," she said, reading his thoughts. "It's not much, but it's clean and safe. The landlady is kind, but she expects weekly payment and finding work is harder than I expected." "What kind of work are you looking for?" Maria's laugh held bitter irony. "What kind of job skills does a nun have in the real world? I can pray, teach children basic catechism, organize charity drives, and prepare simple meals for 50 people. Not exactly marketable skills." "You'd be surprised." David found himself leaning forward, his business mind already spinning possibilities. Administration, event planning, education, non-profit management. You have more skills than you realize. Maybe. But most employers take one look at a pregnant woman and find reasons why the position has already been filled. Her hand moved to her stomach in that protective gesture he was beginning to recognize. "I understand why. I'm a liability." The casual way she dismissed her own worth made David's jaw clench. "You're not a liability. You're an asset that the right employer hasn't recognized yet." "You don't have to say that. I'm not saying it to make you feel better. I'm saying it because it's true." He paused, weighing his next words carefully. "I have a proposition." Her entire body went rigid. "Mr. Sterling. Not that kind of proposition." He held up his hands, recognizing the fear that had flashed across her features. "A job proposition. The Sterling Foundation needs a new director of community outreach. Someone who understands what it's like to need help, who can connect with people the current staff can't reach." "You're offering me charity disguised as employment." "I'm offering you a job you're qualified for." David met her skeptical gaze steadily. "The foundation donates millions every year to causes that sound good on paper but don't always translate to real help for real people. You could change that." "I don't know anything about running a foundation." "You know about being on the receiving end of judgment instead of help. You know what it feels like to need assistance and have people question whether you deserve it. That perspective is worth more than any MBA." Maria was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the hospital blanket. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had learned not to trust easy solutions. What's the catch? No catch. Competitive salary. Full health benefits, maternity leave. The foundation offices are in my building, so we'd see each other regularly, but you'd have your own department, your own staff, complete autonomy in how you structure the programs. And when people find out about my situation? About why I left the convent. David felt anger flare at the thought of anyone judging her. Then they'll learn what I learned, that sometimes the people who understand grace best are the ones who've needed it most. The monitor beside her bed continued its steady beeping, marking moments in a conversation that felt like it was reshaping both their futures. Maria studied his face with that intense scrutiny he was beginning to recognize, looking for deception or ulterior motives. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally. "Really, why?" David considered lying, offering some noble explanation about corporate social responsibility or Christian charity. Instead, he found himself telling the truth. "Because 3 days ago I met someone who reminded me what it feels like to care about something real. Because I've spent 42 years building an empire that means nothing if I don't have anyone to share it with. Because..." He paused, the next words feeling dangerous but necessary. "Because I think maybe you're not the only one who needs saving." The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Outside the hospital room, the world continued its ordinary rhythm. Nurses checking on patients, families holding vigils, lives beginning and ending with mechanical regularity. But inside room 412, something profound was shifting between two broken people who had found each other at exactly the right moment. "I'll think about it," Maria said finally. "That's all I'm asking." A nurse appeared in the doorway, professional smile in place. "Visiting hours are over in 10 minutes." David stood, suddenly reluctant to leave. "Will you be okay here tonight?" "I'll be fine. The doctor wants to monitor me until morning, just to be safe." Maria's eyes met his. "Thank you. For coming, for the job offer, for everything. Get some rest. And Maria." He paused at the door. "Tomorrow, when you're thinking about my offer, don't think about what you deserve or don't deserve. Think about what you could do with the opportunity. Think about all the other women who might need someone to understand their story. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where accepting help felt harder than refusing it? Sometimes our greatest breakthroughs come when we're most vulnerable. Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear about times when unexpected opportunities arose from difficult circumstances. As David walked back through the hospital corridors, he realized that for the first time in years, he was genuinely excited about tomorrow. Whatever Maria decided, this strange, sacred encounter had already changed something fundamental in both their lives. Maria was discharged the next morning with strict instructions to rest and reduce stress, advice that seemed almost mockingly impossible given her circumstances. David arrived as she was signing the discharge papers, looking effortlessly composed in his tailored suit while she felt wrinkled and uncertain in her hastily cleaned habit. "I thought you might need a ride," he said, noting her hesitation. "To wherever you're staying, or to look at the foundation offices if you'd like to see what the job would involve." "The boarding house is fine," she said quickly, then caught herself. "I mean, thank you. That's very kind." During the drive through morning traffic, David found himself stealing glances at her profile. In daylight, away from the hospital's fluorescent harshness, he could see how young she really was, late 20s at most, with the kind of classical features that belonged in Renaissance paintings. But there was something older in her eyes, a depth that spoke of experiences beyond her years. "Tell me about the father," he said suddenly, then immediately regretted the intrusion. "I'm sorry. That's none of my business." "No, if I'm going to work for you, you should know." Maria's voice was carefully controlled. His name was Father Michael Brennan. He was assigned to our parish for 6 months while our regular priest recovered from surgery. The words hit David like ice water. A priest. The betrayal ran even deeper than he'd imagined. He was different from the other clergy who visited. Younger, more passionate about his ministry. He talked about God's love as something transformative, revolutionary. Not just rules and restrictions, but genuine connection with the divine. Her hands twisted in her lap. I was drawn to that vision. To him. David pulled into the parking lot of a small diner, needing to focus on her words rather than navigating traffic. Go on. It started as theological discussions. Late night conversations about faith, about whether love could exist within the constraints of vows, about whether God's plan might be bigger than human institutions. Maria's voice carried the pain of remembering. He said I was the most spiritually connected person he'd ever met. That my questions showed a deeper relationship with God than blind obedience ever could. He was grooming you. The words came out harsher than David intended, fueled by anger at a man he'd never met. Maybe he was as confused as I was. Maria's fairness even toward someone who had hurt her made David's chest tighten. He talked about leaving the priesthood, about how meeting me had shown him that love and faith didn't have to be separate. He made it sound like we were both chosen for something greater. When did you realize it wasn't true? The night I told him I was pregnant. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. I expected joy, or at least acceptance. We'd talked about children, about how raising a family could be its own form of ministry. Instead, he went completely white. Said it was impossible, that I must be mistaken. David felt his hands clench around the steering wheel. What did he do? He left that same night, packed his things and requested an immediate transfer. The next day, Mother Superior called me in and said she'd received a letter from Father Brennan expressing concern about my spiritual stability and suggesting I might be experiencing religious delusions involving inappropriate attachments. He threw you under the bus to save his own career. He protected himself. I understand why, his calling, his reputation, his family's expectations. Admitting what happened would have destroyed everything he'd worked for. Maria's voice carried a terrible kind of acceptance. But it meant I lost everything instead. David turned in his seat to face her fully, seeing the way she held herself like someone braced for another blow. Maria, you know that's not love, right? What he did, that's not what love looks like. I know that now. She met his eyes with devastating honesty. But for months I convinced myself it was. I told myself that love meant sacrifice, that carrying his child alone was somehow noble, that God had chosen me to protect him by accepting all the consequences. And the baby. For the first time since she'd started talking, Maria's face softened. The baby is innocent. This child didn't choose to be conceived in such circumstances, didn't ask to be the result of broken vows and complicated hearts. Whatever mistakes I made, whatever sins I committed, this life deserves protection. Love. David felt something shift inside his chest, not just sympathy for her situation, but admiration for the kind of person who could find grace in the midst of abandonment. That's why you wouldn't consider ending the pregnancy? Never. Her voice carried absolute certainty. I may have failed in my vows to God, but I won't fail this child. Even if I have to raise them alone, even if the world judges us both, this baby will know they were wanted. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of her story settling between them. David found himself thinking about his own childhood, parents who'd provided every material advantage but had somehow never managed to convey that he was genuinely wanted for who he was rather than what he might become. The job offer stands, he said finally. In fact, hearing your story makes me even more certain you're the right person. You understand what it means to be judged, to be abandoned by institutions that should protect you. You could help other people navigate those same systems. Even knowing what you know about me, about how I got here. Especially knowing what I know. David started the car, pulling back onto the street. Maria, I've donated millions to religious organizations that preach about love and forgiveness, then turn their backs on anyone who actually needs either one. You could help me change that. I don't want charity disguised as employment. This isn't charity. This is recognizing that sometimes the people who understand grace best are the ones who've been denied it. He glanced at her as they stopped at a red light. I want to show you the foundation offices. Not to pressure you, just so you can see what the work actually involves. Maria was quiet for a long moment. All right, she said finally. I'll look. But as they drove toward downtown, David found himself hoping she'd say yes for reasons that went far beyond charitable work. Something about her story, her capacity for forgiveness, her determination to find meaning in betrayal, made him want to be better than he'd ever been. For the first time in years, he felt like he might be capable of the kind of love that protected rather than possessed. The question was whether she'd ever be able to trust that kind of love again. The Sterling Foundation occupied the entire 15th floor of David's downtown building, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and conference rooms that spoke of serious money directed towards serious causes. But as Maria walked through the offices, what struck her most was how sterile everything felt, beautiful, professional, and completely disconnected from the human needs it was supposed to address. This is where our community outreach director would work, David said, opening the door to a corner office with a view that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. Your office if you decide to take the position. Maria moved to the windows, looking down at the streets below where real people navigated real problems with far fewer resources than surrounded her now. It's beautiful, she said carefully, but it feels very removed from the communities you're trying to help. That's exactly the problem. David's voice carried frustration that seemed deeper than professional concern. We fund programs, write checks, host galas where wealthy people congratulate themselves on their generosity. But I'm not sure we actually connect with anyone who needs help. When was the last time you visited one of the shelters you fund? The question clearly caught him off guard. We get reports. Regular updates on how the money is being used. Reports written by administrators who want continued funding. Maria turned from the window to study his face. Not the same thing as sitting with someone who's hungry and hearing their actual story. You're right. David loosened his tie, suddenly looking less like a polished philanthropist and more like someone genuinely troubled by his own limitations. I've been insulated from the real impact of what we do. Or don't do. Not intentionally, I think. But wealth creates distance whether you want it to or not. Maria moved around the office, noting the expensive furniture, the art that cost more than most families spent on housing. It's hard to understand what someone needs when you've never needed anything yourself. Is that what you think? That I've never needed anything? Something in his voice made her pause. Haven't you? David was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city skyline. I grew up in a house with 12 bedrooms and parents who scheduled appointments to see their only child. I went to the best schools, had every opportunity money could buy, and graduated feeling completely empty inside. That's different from the kind of need I'm talking about. Is it? He turned to face her, and she saw something raw in his expression. You needed love and got betrayal. I needed love and got transaction. Different circumstances, same result, learning that people will disappoint you if you let them matter too much. The unexpected vulnerability in his admission made Maria's chest tighten. She'd assumed his offer was motivated by guilt or obligation, but there was something more personal driving his interest in her story. "Is that why you've never married?" she asked gently. "I was married. For 3 years. David's smile held no warmth. "Jennifer was everything I thought I wanted, beautiful, sophisticated, from the right family. But she married my net worth, not me. When she left, she told me I was emotionally unavailable, that I treated love like a business transaction." "Were you?" "Probably." His honesty surprised them both. "I don't know how to love without protecting myself. Every relationship feels like a negotiation where I'm trying to figure out what the other person really wants from me." Maria moved closer, drawn by the pain she recognized in his voice. "What do you think I want from you?" "I don't know. That's what makes this terrifying." David met her eyes directly. "With everyone else, I can see the angles, the motivations. But with you, I can't figure out what you're getting from this arrangement that you couldn't get somewhere else." "Maybe that should tell you something." "Like what?" "Like maybe some people don't want anything from you except to know you." The words came out more intimate than she'd intended, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm sorry. I don't mean to overstep." "You're not overstepping." David's voice was soft. "You're saying something I've never heard before." They stood there in the expensive office, surrounded by the trappings of charitable work, but somehow having stumbled into something more personal and more real than either of them had expected. Maria felt the familiar flutter of connection that had gotten her into trouble before, but this felt different, safer somehow, built on honesty rather than illusion. "Can I show you something?" David asked suddenly. Without waiting for an answer, he led her to his private office down the hall. Unlike the foundation spaces, this room felt lived in, personal. Family photos on the desk, books that showed actual use, a comfortable reading chair by the window. "This is where I actually work," he said, settling into the chair and gesturing for her to take the couch nearby. "Where I try to figure out how to make all that money mean something." Maria noticed the books scattered on his coffee table, theology, philosophy, works by authors she recognized from her own spiritual seeking. "You read Merton?" "Thomas Merton, yes. The 7-Story Mountain changed how I think about wealth and responsibility." David picked up the worn paperback. He wrote about how true spiritual poverty isn't about having nothing, but about holding everything lightly. Not being owned by what you own. That's a hard lesson for someone with your resources. Especially when those resources feel more like walls than tools. David's fingers traced the book's cover. "I keep thinking there must be a way to use wealth that connects rather than separates, that builds relationships instead of dependencies." "There is." Maria leaned forward, animated by an idea that felt suddenly clear. What if instead of funding programs, you funded relationships? What if the foundation focused on bringing people together across economic lines, creating genuine connections rather than just writing checks? What would that look like? Mentorship programs where the relationship goes both ways. Community gardens where wealthy families work alongside struggling ones. Dinner programs where everyone contributes something, whether it's money or time or just their story. Maria's voice grew stronger as the vision took shape. Real community instead of charity. David stared at her with something like wonder. "You see it, don't you? How it could actually work." "I see how it should work. Whether we could make it happen is another question." "We." He caught the pronoun hope evident in his voice. Maria realized what she'd said and felt a moment of panic. She'd spent so many months being careful not to hope, not to trust, not to imagine futures that might disappoint her. But something about this conversation, this man, this possibility felt worth the risk. "If I took the job," she said carefully, "if I decided to try this, what would it take for you to decide yes?" She studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulation she'd learned to fear. Instead, she saw genuine curiosity, vulnerability, and something that looked like the beginning of real affection. "I'd need to know that you're serious about changing how things work, not just how they look. I'd need to know that when people judge me, and they will, you'll stand by the decision to hire me." She paused, gathering courage for the most important condition. "And I'd need to know that whatever this is between us stays honest. No hidden agendas, no unspoken expectations." "What do you think this is between us?" The question hung in the air like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Maria felt her heart racing, aware that her answer would change everything between them. "I think," she said slowly, "it's two people who've been hurt learning to trust again. I think it's friendship, maybe, or the possibility of friendship. I think." She met his eyes directly. "I think it's something good if we're careful with it." David smiled then, the first completely unguarded expression she'd seen from him. "I think it's something good too." "What do you believe is the foundation of genuine friendship, shared experiences, mutual respect, or something deeper?" Sometimes the most meaningful connections form between people who understand each other's struggles. Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear about a friendship that surprised you with its depth. As they sat there in the fading afternoon light, both David and Maria felt the fragile beginning of something neither had expected to find. Trust, maybe. Hope, certainly. And the possibility that healing could be a shared journey rather than a solitary struggle. 6 weeks later, Maria's transformation seemed nothing short of miraculous. The Sterling Foundation's community outreach had evolved from writing exercises into genuine relationship building initiatives. She'd organized monthly dinners where wealthy donors sat beside shelter residents, sharing stories over home-cooked meals. The mentorship program she'd designed paired struggling families with established ones, creating bonds that transcended simple charity. Even the Foundation's quarterly reports read differently now, filled with names and faces instead of just statistics. David found himself looking forward to their daily check-ins with an anticipation that felt dangerous. Maria had blossomed in the role, her natural grace and hard-earned wisdom making her beloved by staff and community members alike. Her pregnancy was showing now, a gentle curve beneath her professional dresses that she wore with quiet pride rather than shame. But success, David had learned, often bred its own complications. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning when board member Harold Whitman arrived unannounced, his expression grim as he settled into David's office without invitation. "We need to talk," Harold said, dropping a manila folder on the desk. "About your new hire." David didn't need to open the folder to know what it contained, but he did anyway. Photos of Maria entering and leaving the convent. Copies of personnel records from St. Catherine's. A letter from Mother Superior detailing the circumstances of Maria's departure. And at the bottom, a photograph that made his blood run cold, Maria and Father Michael Brennan standing close together in what was clearly an intimate moment, her face turned up toward his with unmistakable adoration. "Where did you get these?" David's voice was carefully controlled. "Does it matter? What matters is that you've put the Foundation at risk by hiring a pregnant ex-nun who was sleeping with a priest." Harold's tone carried the satisfaction of someone delivering a killing blow. "The Catholic Archdiocese is threatening to pull their support. 3 major donors have already called expressing concern. This could destroy everything we've built." David closed the folder, but the image of Maria looking at another man with such trust and love was burned into his retinas. Maria's personal life is none of our business. Her personal life becomes our business when it threatens $50 million in annual donations. Harold leaned forward aggressively. "David, I know you have feelings for this woman, but you can't let sentiment cloud your judgment. She has to go. She's the best director we've ever had. The programs she's created actually work. The programs don't matter if we can't fund them." Harold stood, smoothing his expensive suit. "The board is meeting Thursday to discuss her termination. I'm giving you the courtesy of handling this privately before it becomes a public spectacle." After Harold left, David sat alone in his office, staring at the closed folder as if it might spontaneously combust. The rational part of his mind understood the business case for letting Maria go. The foundation couldn't survive without donor support, and public scandal could undo years of carefully built relationships. But the irrational part, the part that had been slowly healing through their friendship, felt like Harold had just asked him to cut off his own arm. David found Maria in the community room, teaching a group of teenagers from a local shelter how to prepare their own budget proposals for small business ideas. Her face was animated, glowing with the kind of genuine joy he'd rarely seen in corporate settings. She looked up when he entered, her smile faltering at his expression. "Could I speak with you privately?" he asked. They walked to her office in silence, David's internal struggle evident in every step. Maria settled behind her desk, her hands instinctively moving to her stomach in the protective gesture he'd grown to recognize. "What's wrong?" she asked. David placed the folder on her desk without opening it. "The board knows about your situation. About Father Brennan." He watched the color drain from her face as she opened the folder, her fingers trembling as she saw the photographs. When she reached the intimate image of herself and Michael, she made a soft sound of pain that cut through David's chest like a blade. "Where did they get this?" "I don't know. It doesn't matter." David moved to the window, unable to watch her pain. "Harold wants you gone. Says the donors are threatening to pull funding." "And what do you want?" Her voice was barely audible. This was the moment David had been dreading, the choice between protecting what they'd built together and protecting what he'd built before her. He thought about the Foundation's mission, about the programs that would die without funding, about the hundreds of people who depended on their work. "I want you to stay," he said finally. "But I can't ignore the board's concerns." "That's not an answer." David turned to face her, seeing his own anguish reflected in her dark eyes. "Maria, if we lose donor support, everything you've created disappears. The dinner programs, the mentorships, the community outreach, all of it." "So you're asking me to leave?" "I'm asking you to consider whether fighting this battle is worth destroying everything we've accomplished." Maria stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. "What you're really asking is whether I'm worth the risk. Whether someone like me deserves to have good things, or if I should accept that my mistakes will always follow me." "That's not what I'm saying." "Isn't it?" Her voice carried a pain that went deeper than professional disappointment. "David, I trusted you. I believed you when you said my past didn't define me, when you said I deserved to be here. But at the first sign of real cost, you're ready to sacrifice me to protect your reputation." "It's not about reputation. It's about survival." "Whose survival? The Foundation's or your own comfort?" Maria moved closer, her eyes blazing with hurt and anger. "Because I've survived being abandoned before. I've survived judgment and shame and starting over with nothing. But I don't know if I can survive being abandoned by someone I thought actually cared about me." The words hit David like physical blows, each one exposing the cowardice he'd been trying to dress up as pragmatism. "I do care about you." "Not enough." Maria's voice broke on the words. "Not enough to fight for me when it gets difficult. Just like Michael, when the cost of loving me became too high, you're choosing the safer path. This is nothing like what he did to you. Isn't it?" He protected his career by throwing me away. You're protecting your foundation by doing the same thing." She gathered her purse and coat with shaking hands. "The only difference is you're being more polite about it." "Maria, please. Let's talk about this. Figure out another solution." She paused at the door, her back to him. "I gave you my resignation 6 weeks ago, the day you offered me this job. I told you I couldn't afford to trust the wrong person again. But I let myself hope that you were different." "I am different." "No," she said softly. "You're exactly the same. You just took longer to show me." The door closed behind her with quiet finality, leaving David alone in her office surrounded by the evidence of everything she'd built. Program proposals covered in her careful handwriting. Thank you letters from families she'd helped. Photos from community events where she'd brought people together across every kind of divide. On her desk, beside the damning folder Harold had delivered, lay her resignation letter, already written, dated that morning. As if she'd known this moment was coming long before he'd walked through her door. As if she'd never really believed she deserved to stay. David sank into her chair, surrounded by the wreckage of something precious he'd just chosen to destroy. For the first time in years, he understood exactly what his ex-wife had meant about emotional unavailability. He'd learned to love the idea of Maria, her strength, her grace, her capacity for forgiveness. But when loving her required real courage, real sacrifice, he'd chosen safety instead. Outside her windows, the city continued its relentless rhythm, indifferent to the small tragedy unfolding in an expensive office where 2 damaged people had briefly found healing, only to discover that some wounds run too deep for even love to reach. David spent the next 3 days in a state of suspended animation, mechanically attending meetings while his mind replayed every moment of their final conversation. The foundation offices felt hollow without Maria's presence. Programs continued, staff meetings happened, donors were reassured, but the soul had gone out of everything they'd built together. On Friday evening, he found himself driving aimlessly through the city, past the shelter where Maria had first taught him about genuine need, past the community center where her dinner programs had brought together people who would never have met otherwise. Each location felt like a memorial to possibilities he'd killed through his own cowardice. He ended up at St. Catherine's Convent. The building looked different in twilight, less forbidding, more like what it had always been meant to be, a place of sanctuary. David sat in his car across the street, remembering the day he'd first seen Maria on these steps, carrying herself with dignity even in exile. A figure emerged from the convent's side entrance, an elderly nun he didn't recognize, moving slowly toward the small garden behind the building. Without fully deciding, David crossed the street and approached the garden gate. "Excuse me, sister," he called softly. The nun turned, her weathered face kind but cautious. "Yes. I'm David Sterling. I knew Sister Maria." Before she left. Recognition dawned in the nun's eyes, followed by something that might have been guilt. "Mr. Sterling. Yes, I know who you are. I'm Sister Catherine. You were her friend." "I tried to be." Sister Catherine's voice carried regret. "Though I failed her when she needed me most." "How so?" Sister Catherine gestured toward a bench beneath a small statue of St. Francis. "May I speak plainly, Mr. Sterling? I've carried this burden for months." David settled beside her, struck by how much easier it was to have difficult conversations in gardens than in boardrooms. "Please." Maria was the most devout young woman I've ever known. Pure in heart, generous in spirit, completely dedicated to serving God through serving others. Sister Catherine's fingers worked her rosary beads. "When Father Brennan arrived, I should have seen what was happening." "What do you mean?" "He was, predatory isn't the right word, but close. Charismatic, certainly. He had a gift for making people feel special, chosen. Several of the younger sisters were drawn to his passionate preaching, but Maria. She paused. Maria was different, vulnerable in ways she didn't recognize. David felt cold dread settling in his stomach. Vulnerable how? She'd lost her parents so young, had been seeking father figures her entire life. When Father Brennan began paying special attention to her theological insights, treating her like an intellectual equal rather than a subordinate, she bloomed under the attention. Sister Catherine's voice grew heavy with self-recrimination. I watched it happening and told myself it was mentorship, spiritual guidance. When did you realize it was more? The night he left. Maria came to my cell, sobbing, asking me to help her understand how God could let her love someone so deeply if it was wrong. She was 3 months pregnant and completely heartbroken. Sister Catherine wiped tears from her cheeks. I should have comforted her. Should have helped her see that she was the victim, not the sinner. But you didn't. I was afraid. Afraid of scandal, afraid of what it would mean for the convent if word got out. So I stayed silent when Mother Superior painted Maria as a fallen woman who had seduced a priest. The admission seemed to physically pain her. I let an innocent girl take the blame for a man's manipulation because it was easier than facing the truth. David felt pieces of understanding click into place, Maria's immediate assumption that he had ulterior motives, her certainty that she didn't deserve good things, her inability to believe she was truly wanted rather than used. She never seduced anyone, he said with quiet certainty. She was used by someone she trusted, then abandoned by everyone who should have protected her. Sister Catherine met his eyes directly. Including, I suspect, by you. The words hit like a confession booth revelation. You're right. What happened? David found himself telling this elderly nun everything, the job offer, their growing friendship, the board's ultimatum, his choice to protect the foundation rather than defend Maria. Sister Catherine listened without judgment, her expression growing sadder with each detail. And now? She asked when he finished. Now I don't know how to fix what I've broken. Have you tried apologizing? She won't see me. Won't answer my calls. I went to her boarding house, but the landlady said she'd moved out. Sister Catherine was quiet for a long moment, watching the shadows lengthen across the garden. Mr. Sterling, may I ask you something? Of course. Do you love her? The question stopped David's breath. He'd been thinking about caring, about protection, about friendship and partnership and all the safe words that didn't require complete vulnerability. But love, real, transformative, life-changing love, that was something he'd convinced himself he wasn't capable of. I think I do, he said finally. I think I have from the moment I saw her on those steps, holding her head high despite everything that had been taken from her. Then you need to decide what love means to you. Is it a feeling you experience privately, or an action you take publicly? Sister Catherine stood slowly. Because Maria has spent her entire adult life being loved in private and abandoned in public. If you truly love her, you'll need to choose her openly, despite the cost. What if it's too late? What if she can't trust me again? Then you'll learn what Maria learned, that love sometimes means accepting consequences you didn't choose. Sister Catherine smiled sadly. But Mr. Sterling, if you truly love someone, you fight for them even when the odds are against you. Especially then. As David drove away from the convent, he felt something shifting inside his chest, not the comfortable warmth of affection or the satisfying glow of good deeds, but the terrifying, exhilarating recognition of complete commitment. For the first time in his life, someone mattered more than his own comfort, his own security, his own carefully constructed world. The question was whether he had the courage to prove it. Saturday morning found him in his office, not because he had work to do, but because it was the only place he could think clearly. He sat at his desk, staring at a blank piece of paper, trying to figure out how to undo the damage his cowardice had caused. The solution, when it came to him, was terrifyingly simple. David picked up his phone and called an emergency board meeting for Monday morning. Then he called his lawyer, his publicist, and his personal assistant, setting in motion a series of conversations that would either redeem him or destroy everything he'd built. But as he worked through the weekend, preparing for what felt like the most important presentation of his life, one thought kept him focused. Maria deserved someone who would choose her publicly, completely, without reservation. It was time to find out if he could be that man. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that matched David's internal state as he walked into the Sterling Foundation boardroom. The 12 members of his board sat around the polished mahogany table like a tribunal, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. Harold Whitman occupied his usual seat at David's right hand, radiating the confidence of someone who believed he'd already won. "Gentlemen, ladies," David began, standing at the head of the table rather than taking his customary chair. "Thank you for gathering on short notice. I know Harold called this meeting to discuss Maria Santos's termination, but I'm here to discuss something else entirely." He pressed a button on the remote in his hand, and the wall-mounted screen displayed the Foundation's mission statement in bold letters: to serve the vulnerable with dignity, compassion, and unwavering commitment to human worth. 6 months ago, we were failing at this mission. We were writing checks to organizations that kept the needy at arm's length, funding programs that treated symptoms while ignoring causes. We were charitable in the safest, most comfortable way possible. David's voice grew stronger as he continued. Then Maria Santos showed me what actual service looks like. Harold shifted in his seat. "David, we've already discussed. We've discussed protecting our reputation and maintaining donor relationships. We haven't discussed whether those things matter more than our actual mission." David clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from Maria's programs. In 6 months, our community outreach initiatives have created lasting connections between 200 families across economic lines. The mentorship program has a 95% satisfaction rate from both mentors and participants. The community dinner program has a waiting list. Board member Elizabeth Chen leaned forward. "The results are impressive, David, but the scandal." "What scandal?" "That a young woman was manipulated by someone in power and then blamed for it? That she chose to protect the life growing inside her rather than hide her mistake? That she's worked tirelessly to help others despite being judged and abandoned by institutions that should have supported her?" David's voice carried an edge of anger that surprised even him. "If that's scandalous, then we need to examine what we actually believe about redemption and second chances." He clicked to the next slide, the photograph of Maria and Father Brennan that had been used to condemn her but now surrounded by context he'd spent the weekend researching. This photo was taken by a private investigator hired by certain Catholic diocesan officials who were suspicious of Father Brennan's spiritual mentorship of several young nuns. They were building a case against him when he requested transfer and disappeared. Maria wasn't his first victim. She was just the one who got pregnant. Uncomfortable murmurs rippled around the table. Harold's face had gone pale. "Furthermore," David continued, "I've spoken with canon lawyers who confirm that Maria's vows were invalidated the moment she was coerced into sexual relations by her spiritual director. In the eyes of church law, she was never truly married to the church because the relationship was built on manipulation." Board member James Morrison spoke up. "Even if that's true, David, the public doesn't understand canonical law. They see a pregnant ex-nun, and donors react accordingly. Then let's give them the full story." David clicked to his final slide, a press release he'd prepared but not yet sent. "I'm calling a press conference for this afternoon to announce the Sterling Foundation's new direction. We're launching a comprehensive program to support women who've been victimized by religious authorities, starting with full scholarships for education and job training. You can't be serious, Harold sputtered. The backlash will be enormous. Good. Let's find out who our real supporters are. David's voice carried calm certainty. The donors who abandon us because we chose to protect the vulnerable over our reputation aren't donors we want anyway. Elizabeth studied the press release on her tablet. What about Maria? Have you discussed this with her? I haven't spoken to Maria since she resigned. David felt the weight of that admission. This isn't about winning her back or making grand gestures. This is about doing what's right, regardless of personal consequences. And if she doesn't want to return? Then she doesn't return. But she'll know that someone finally chose to defend her publicly, without conditions or expectations. David looked around the table, meeting each member's eyes. The question before us isn't whether we can afford to take this stand. It's whether we can afford not to. The room fell silent except for the soft drumming of rain against the windows. David could see the internal calculations happening. Board members weighing reputation against principle, financial security against moral imperative. Finally, Elizabeth spoke. I move to support David's proposal. Seconded, said James, surprising everyone including himself. One by one, the other members voiced their support, until only Harold remained opposed, his face twisted with barely contained fury. This is corporate suicide, he hissed. And for what? A pregnant nun who'll probably never even thank you for it. For doing what's right. David gathered his materials, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. Harold, your resignation from the board will be accepted whenever you're ready to submit it. The press conference was a media circus, exactly as Harold had predicted. Reporters shouted questions about religious scandal, financial responsibility, and David's personal relationship with Maria. He answered each question calmly, factually, refusing to be drawn into sensationalism. The Sterling Foundation exists to serve the vulnerable, he concluded. Maria Santos embodied that mission better than anyone we've ever employed. If supporting her work costs us donors, then those donors never understood what we were trying to accomplish anyway. As the crowd dispersed, David's assistant approached with a worried expression. Sir, we've already received calls from 3 major donors threatening to pull funding. And 5 new donors offering to replace them. Plus interview requests from women's advocacy groups, religious reform organizations, and at least a dozen major publications wanting to tell the full story. David smiled for the first time in days. Sometimes taking the right stand revealed support you never knew existed. He found Maria in the last place he expected, the small chapel at St. Mary's Hospital, where they'd first begun to trust each other. She sat in the back pew, her hands folded over her now prominent belly, her face peaceful in the colored light from stained glass windows. I saw the press conference, she said without turning around. Sister Catherine called to tell me about your visit to the convent. David slid into the pew beside her, careful to maintain distance. I'm not here to ask for anything. I just wanted you to know that you were right. About everything. Was I? I was exactly like him. I loved you in private but chose safety over courage when it mattered. David's voice was quiet in the sacred space. I spent my whole life protecting myself from disappointment, and in the process, I became someone who disappoints others. Maria finally looked at him, her dark eyes unreadable. Why did you do it? The press conference, the new program? You could have just let it go quietly. Because you deserved someone to fight for you. Because I realized that love isn't a feeling you protect, it's an action you take, especially when it's difficult. He met her gaze directly. Because I love you, Maria. Not romantically, not possessively, but completely. I love your strength and your gentleness and your capacity to find grace in impossible circumstances. David. She began, but he held up his hand. I'm not asking for forgiveness or another chance or anything from you. I'm just telling you that you matter. That you've always mattered. That choosing you over everything else was the easiest decision I've ever made once I finally had the courage to make it. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of his words settling between them like a bridge neither was sure how to cross. The baby kicked for the first time last week, Maria said finally. Right here, actually, during evening prayers. Boy or girl? I don't know yet. I'm thinking about names, though. She smiled slightly. David is on the list. His breath caught. Maria. Not because of you. Well, not only because of you. Because it means beloved. And this child will be beloved no matter what circumstances brought them here. She placed his hand on her belly, and he felt the flutter of new life beneath his palm. But also because the David I know now, the one who chose love over fear, that's the kind of person I'd want this child to grow up to be. Does this mean? It means I'm willing to try trusting again. Slowly, carefully, with clear boundaries and honest conversation. Maria's voice carried the wisdom of someone who had learned to protect herself without closing her heart. It means I'd like my child to know their Uncle David, if you're interested in the job. I can't think of anything I'd rather be. As they sat together in the quiet chapel, David felt something he'd never experienced before, the peace that comes from choosing love without conditions, from protecting someone else's heart as carefully as his own. Whether their relationship remained friendship or grew into something deeper didn't matter in this moment. What mattered was that they'd both learned to trust again, to believe in the possibility of love that heals rather than harms. 3 months later, when little David Santos was born with his mother's dark eyes and his own determination to be heard, Uncle David was there to witness his first breath, his first cry, his first grasp at the light streaming through the hospital windows. And 6 months after that, when Maria walked down the aisle in a simple white dress with her son in her arms and joy radiating from every step, David Sterling waited at the altar not as a man claiming a prize, but as someone who had learned that the most sacred vows are the ones made to protect and cherish without conditions. Father Martinez, the progressive priest who had replaced the diocesan officials responsible for covering up abuse, pronounced them husband and wife with words that echoed through the small chapel. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. As David kissed his bride, his sacred wife, he understood finally what Maria had always known. That sometimes the most beautiful redemption comes not from avoiding our failures, but from choosing love in spite of them, again and again, until grace transforms everything it touches. What do you think makes the difference between love that heals and love that harms? Sometimes our greatest growth comes from learning to trust again after betrayal. I'd love to hear your thoughts on second chances and the courage it takes to love without guarantees. Share your reflections below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.